I'm Robert Old, the director of the Bruges Group. In this film we're talking to a number of Conservative MPs and experts and academics who have concerns, just like us, about the EU's foreign policy towards Ukraine. As Britain's leading EU critical think tank, of course we question the sincerity of the European Union when they claim to be advancing the independence of Ukraine. Relations between the UK and Russia are very important. Russia matters, especially to Britain. Britain's relations with Russia are far too important to be left to inexperienced people and untried institutions, namely the European External Action Service. The Bruges Group first addressed this issue when the Honourable Bernard Jenkin MP came to speak at one of our regular meetings.
We are actually on the way to causing a civil war, the two of us, in Ukraine, which a conflict that will haunt Europe for generations to come. And the only country that could possibly benefit from such an outcome is China.
Second half of March 2014. Listening to the media in Britain and most of our politicians, we would think that the events in Crimea, the referendum and reunification were things that had just happened in isolation. It is as if the events of even early March had been forgotten, as if Vladimir Putin's actions were totally out of the blue, rather than in response to a rapidly changing situation in Ukraine, which he did not instigate nor encourage.
The EU has blundered its way into a crisis. Brussels planned to swallow Ukraine whole, but Ukraine is now experiencing a disaster. It is unable to maintain its borders, nor even internal security. It is close to becoming a failed state. The EU creates a chaotic situation and is surprised that Russia also moves. How did such a catastrophic blunder occur?
I don't know what role the EU had, if any, in the street protests and the developments that threw out an elected president. But I do know that the EU was making overtures without thinking about the likely Russian reaction, and now find themselves in the position where they're not following through because they don't seem to be able to reach agreement on strong measures to respond to the Russian intervention. So I think that is actions which has destabilised the position, and I hope now the EU will rise to its responsibilities and will take a responsible view from here, because the last thing we want is conflict or damaging political tensions spreading in that part of the world.
Although he was hardly a role model for selfless public service, Yanukovych did try to chart a course for Ukraine that sought to balance relations with Russia against European aspirations. He was no pro-Russian politician, supporting intervention in Iraq, refusing to follow Moscow in recognizing the breakaway republics of South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent, and continuing cooperation with NATO. Russia undoubtedly placed pressure on Ukraine to reject the association agreement. But the reality is that the EU also did a lot of bullying and exacerbated the crisis by trying to force Ukraine to choose between a European future and ties to a country with which it feels a deep and historical cultural affinity. The EU placed restrictive quotas on Ukrainian exports to the single market. These would only be waived if the Ukraine entered into a trade agreement with Brussels. This would have forced Ukraine to adopt EU regulations. The EU refused to countenance Yanukovych's suggestion of a trilateral EU-Russia-Ukraine Commission to address trade disputes. They made it clear that they would lobby the IMF to refuse Ukraine the bridging loans it needed to cover its external debt if he did not sign the agreement. It refused to offer any concession to address the real pain and bankruptcy that would be caused if Ukraine were to surrender free trade access to the Russian market. Rather than recognise that Ukraine will always have complex and intertwined relations with Russia, and that its economy is largely dependent on Russian goodwill, the EU instead demanded a clean break. Faced with an impossible situation, and both sides placing Ukraine under unbearable pressure, Yanukovych had little option but to postpone the agreement. That his decision to do so would prompt protests should not have been unexpected, but what was deeply unwise was the open support given by Baroness Ashton and EU foreign ministers to those who called for the overthrow of Ukraine's elected government. One can only imagine the response if Sergei Lavrov turned up in Scotland in support of the campaign for independence, or openly egged on the London rioters and encouraged them to overthrow David Cameron. While hardly blameless, Moscow's statement that the West has shown little regard for international law in its handling of the Ukraine crisis has an element of truth.
And it must look to a Russian as though this is a rather aggressive posture which is being taken by the European state.
I'm very worried about the Ukrainian crisis. Russia has behaved badly in a way which is provocative to interests in the West. But I'm also very concerned that the European Union seems to be flexing its words in a way which Russia finds worrying and provokes Russia flexing its military muscles. And that's exactly what we don't want to see in a very sensitive part of Eastern Europe against the Russian border. I thought we were living in a better period. We seem to be in a period of much less tension between the West and Russia than in the Cold War era. We seem to have found a way of living alongside Russia, and Russia had accepted reduced borders with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think we need to be very careful now with someone in charge in Russia who feels intimidated or surrounded by the West, or who has traditional Russian imperial ambitions. And I'm not sure the European Union has behaved responsibly or sensibly in dealing with that problem.
Let us take a few moments to look at the broader historical context and the events immediately preceding the EU's crisis in Ukraine. Part of Russia for over 300 years, the peninsula, was only transferred to the Soviet Republic of Ukraine by Khrushchev in 1954 as a symbolic gesture. When USSR fell, many in Crimea felt they had been left on the wrong side of the border, and politics in the region throughout the 1990s was dominated by unsuccessful attempts to secede and rejoin with Russia.
So the last thing that we should be involved in doing is fomenting that division and driving the population apart, which driving one half of the population to the arms of the Russians in an attempt to bring Ukraine into the European orbit. But I have just seen...
So there's an emerging crisis within Ukraine and Crimea. Do you think the European Union has had a role in stirring that up, in creating tensions and adding to the political divisions that exist there?
Well, it certainly does seem the fact that the EU are trying to entice Ukraine towards them hasn't helped the situation, and there's been a response from Russia, and we have a major European crisis. I'm not sure that the way the EU has acted has necessarily been helpful.
The founding myth of the EU is the reconciliation of France and Germany after World War II. Peace based on the equality of victor and vanquished. No more Versailles. These are the virtues of the European idea. Yet after the end of the Cold War, these principles were forgotten by Europe, and the EU sought to humiliate and subordinate Russia. This will bring no joy to Europe.
I think we have perhaps been at fault in not understanding the feelings of the average Russian since the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Warsaw Pact and the collapse of the USSR. One moment, as a Russian citizen, you could take pride in the fact that you were a citizen of one of the world's great superpowers, standing eye to eye with the United States. And then suddenly that world began to disintegrate around about you. The Warsaw Pact went, the USSR went, countries like Poland, Czech Republic, the others were moving from the Russian influence into the Western influence. Now at that moment, it seems to me, the West would have been well advised to put an arm round Russia and to say, these have been terrible years. How can we work together for our mutual benefit. What are our mutual interests? Who are our mutual enemies? After all, we share a European heritage, Christian heritage, very much that we have in common. Sadly, we didn't do that, and so we left the Russians feeling bruised. And I think the rise of Putin and Russian nationalism is part of the dividend of those actions.
Not everyone sees the events in Ukraine as a disaster. Some Europhiles consider the EU to be having a beneficial crisis. John Stevens is one of the very few remaining true advocates of the EU ideal willing to speak out in Britain today. Unlike Nick Clegg, he even believes the euro was a good idea. John Stevens is a former MEP, founder of pro-euro organisations, and was actually in Kiev during the Euromaidan putsch. Whilst John Stevens is not an official spokesman of the European Union, he does rather reveal the ambitions and fantasies of those circles.
No, I think it's been a big success. I think getting rid of Yanukovych is a big step forward for the people of the Ukraine, and it's moved dramatically in a pro-European, pro-Western direction.
Inevitably, this will require a subsidy, adding even more to the cost of EU membership.
We've won a big victory, and now it needs to be consolidated, above all, with economic aid to the Ukraine.
To try to understand the Russians is not to become a Russian. In this film we are trying to understand the other chap's point of view. It is understandable that Vladimir Putin perceives the EU and US activities as hostile. Putin has a point when he talks of the repeated betrayal of the post-Cold War understanding that NATO and the EU would not advance up to Russia's borders, and the US and EU have formed when it comes to illegal and bloody invasion and regime change within the post-Cold War era. Iraq, of course, Haiti, Gaddafi in Libya all of a sudden, and so on. And in Europe, the war on Serbia resulting in the Kosovo experience, and more gently, Greece and Italy, where conventional democracy was suspended. So when Putin hears himself vilified as a dictator, and hysterical calls for sanctions for offences the EU, the US, commit as a matter of routine, he might well recognise a pattern. Euro neocons vie on a daily basis to come out with ever more hysterical calls for economic blood. Vladimir Putin might get the idea that the EU and the US might step up programmes to destabilise Russia. The EU may consider it a victory, but the Ukraine they have won is badly damaged and divided. Still, what will the EU want next?
Well, we want to get rid of Putin, yes. I mean, there is absolutely no question that having got rid of Yanukovych, the next objective is to get rid of Putin. And one of the things which I think is a factor in the current situation is that Putin himself is nervous that the sort of issues that were raised in the Ukrainian revolution will turn up on the streets of Moscow. We would certainly want Belarus.
We're here with Dr. Martin Holmes, the author of European Integration, Scope and Limits, and a former co-chairman of the Bruges Group.
I think one of the problems with EU policy here is just grandstanding. It's the idea that the EU should have a united foreign policy to project Europe on the world stage. We've seen this over the years. I remember when the French Prime Minister described the Japanese as ants, and when European policy appeared to be anti-Japanese, then it went through a long phase of being anti-American. And it was almost as if the Americans said that 2 + 2 = 4, the EU would oppose them. Now it's going through this phase of projecting its power against Russia. So this, I think, is a very unattractive feature of the development of an EU common foreign policy. And we've seen this over the Crimean and Ukrainian crisis, with the way in which the EU wants to bestride the world and to lay down rules and regulations that go way beyond its jurisdiction. So this, I think, is a very worrying development.
That there is a new EU foreign minister and an EU policy is totally wrong. And, you know, we can't have people going to the Ukraine saying things allegedly on our behalf when in fact, no, we have our own policy. Should be what our Home Foreign Secretary says, it's for our own Parliament to decide. And there are clearly issues on both sides, and you need cool heads and a peaceful resolution to it. What we don't want is, you know, escalating sanctions and going back to the Cold War.
Regard to the Ukraine, taken by the German Chancellor, the French President, and the Polish Foreign Minister, Sikorski, who's a rather remarkable man. The vision, such as it is, and I don't think it's sufficient, is actually with Radek Sikorski, with Chancellor Merkel, and with President Hollande. The German economic strength, and in the background, you can't be wholly denied in this. France is there. Why does France matter? Nuclear weapons. It's as simple as that. And that was the really crucial axis in all of this.
EU-inspired sanctions against Russian businessmen and Russian-owned businesses will harm investment in the UK. It'll also damage trade between Britain and Russia.
Ignati runs a specialist consultancy in London, helping mainly British small and medium-sized enterprises do business in Russia. He and his clients in the UK are the people who will suffer from the sanctions game.
If you talk about sanctions, probably not the only person who is worried about them, but to me it looks like a childish game when a bunch of children would argue with each other and blame each other on something, and it's not as mature states and mature people should behave. And in this sense, as a business person as well, I'm worried about my business, which is helping British businesses get into Russia and doing things together, cooperating together for the benefit of both nations. And as an example, I can give the counter sanctions which the Russian government proposes to do now, which is to ban importing medical equipment from Europe into Russia, which definitely has bad consequences for my clients who want to import very good quality medical devices from the UK into Russia for cooperation with their Russian colleagues and for the use, for the benefit of the Russian health. And I can see how the sanctions immediately make an adverse effect on my client's business as well as on my business as well.
Sanctions are not just an economic phenomenon that can be turned on and off. They can poison relations in the world for a long time to come.
Short and medium term consequences for business and international business, because UK businesses were always very cautious about doing business overseas and in Russia particularly, despite our countries being trading to each other, with each other for centuries. It's no longer happening on a very active level. There are probably around 600 British companies operating in Russia. That's nothing.
Well, I think the sanctions are particularly stupid and counterproductive. Now, I can understand that the Americans, with their long history of dislike of the Soviet Union and of viewing Congress that Russia is a continuation of the Soviet Union, I can understand that the Americans might want to impose sanctions because they're approaching oil self-sufficiency. The fracking revolution in energy is essentially based in the United States. So America's geostrategic energy position is quite a strong one. But for the European Union to be threatening sanctions against Russia really strikes me as very stupid indeed. At some stage, if the Russians retaliate, the weapon they will use is oil, and even if the EU is able to buy oil from elsewhere, the price will rise. Now, the last thing the EU economy needs now is an increase in the price of oil. The EU economy is absolutely on its knees because of the absurdities of the Eurozone, the long and deep recession which the single currency experiment has produced. For countries like Greece and Spain and Portugal and Italy and Cyprus, the idea that EU foreign policy may lead to retaliation and an increase in energy prices, that is economically counterproductive.
We are yet to hear what the US and Europe has to propose about further sanctions. It seems like it will be evolving within the next week or so, and we don't know what the scope of these sanctions. But even the rhetoric about sanctions is harming, because you can't really heal what the bad words have in themselves.
When there was a row about whether Georgia and Ukraine should be invited to join NATO, most people in Chatham House seem to be very opposed to offending Russia in this way. But now that it's about Europe, they've issued this paper and they're recommending that Ukraine's territorial integrity should be non-negotiable, and we can't discuss it while it's under threat and occupation by the Russians. That Crimea, the critical test is Crimea, and the credibility of the EU and the US commitment to these principles is subject to the referendum in Crimea. The West's demand must be a return of Russian forces to their bases in Crimea and withdrawal of the massive influx of other Russian forces. They would go on to explain how we should do that. They said that should the Russian government not de-escalate its military presence in Crimea, we should chuck them out of the G8, chuck them out of OECD, suspend trade negotiations, and we should start attacking their economy. When did Chatham House become sort of Euro-neocon in this way? And I wonder whether, in fact, we're not in danger of seeing everything through a European lens, an EU lens, instead of seeing our own interests and our own objectives as a nation, and indeed global security, objectively and dispassionately.
Far from condemning inflammatory statements by far-right groups and dampening anti-Russian sentiment, from Moscow's perspective, the EU appeared to be actively encouraging it. The new Ukrainian parliament's first actions exacerbated Russian speakers' fears. Recent events have shown us that the far right in Ukraine holds a growing and disproportionate influence in the new government, and it is wrong of the EU to overlook this just because their hostility is directed towards Russians.
Talking to some Ukrainian protesters.
Just as the crisis has undermined confidence in the European Union, it's also divided opinion amongst Russia's near neighbours. Some appear to relish conflict with Russia. However, others see that maintaining good and healthy relations with their large neighbour is a much more productive way forward. We spoke to an Estonian who was with the Ukrainian protesters in London about how the instability may affect Estonia.
Well, I hope Estonia will stay an independent country. We have NATO, and if something happens, I hope we're gonna get protected.
You have to admire the patriots who give up their weekends to demonstrate. But there is a lack of coherence amongst their opinions about what they actually want.
We want recognition more than anything of everything that's going on in Ukraine. I mean,
they are campaigning for the independence of Ukraine, but who is threatening that sovereignty?
I think for more Ukrainians it's more leaning towards the West. I think eventually the EU integration is probably what we're hoping more for.
Events in Ukraine have been presented as a simple case of good versus evil, of democracy versus dictatorship, and of Europe versus Russia. Viktor Yanukovych is often described as being pro-Russian, as if that in itself was sufficient reason to depose him, while Russia has been accused of bullying Ukraine to keep it in Moscow's sphere of influence.
Their main claim on the UK is the Budapest Memorandum. This asserts Ukrainian territorial integrity in exchange for the elimination of their stockpile of nukes, which were a legacy from the USSR. But given the current government in charge of Ukraine at the moment, it is probably just as well they have no more nuclear weapons.
The Budapest Memorandum is an agreement between the UK, the USA and Russia. It is the lowest level of agreement between those three countries, and in fact is not binding upon Britain.
Russia also has a valid point that the EU has shown double standards in its application of the principles of territorial integrity and self-determination, supporting the independence of Kosovo but refusing to countenance the demands of those who would prefer to break away from other European states to look towards Moscow, regardless of how valid their claims might be. Compared to Kosovo, Russia's actions in Crimea appear moderate. At the time of production, there has been no warfare, no killings, no pogroms, or ethnic cleansing, and there appears a clear democratic mandate for its incorporation into Russia. Compared this to the violence, bloodshed, and ethnic cleansing that followed Western intervention in Kosovo, or similar interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Like Yugoslavia, Ukraine is clearly a failed state. And the best thing for the international community to do, including the EU, is to negotiate an orderly breakup. So there would be a Western Ukraine, an Eastern Ukraine, and Crimea would be able to choose whether it joined either of the Ukraines or indeed Russia. And all we've heard from the EU is the territorial integrity of the Ukraine will be protected. So I think they're repeating the mistakes from 20 years ago. But Robert, what I think is particularly interesting here is that some of the EU states that are saying this are themselves the result of a breakup of failed states. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, how are they in the EU? The answer, because the Soviet Union broke up. Slovenia and Croatia, how are they in the EU? Answer, Yugoslavia, a failed state, broke up. The Czech Republic and Slovakia are separate states because the failed state of Czechoslovakia broke up. The history of the EU's enlargement over the last 20 years shows that it has adjusted to the reality of the breakup of states, which is why it is so bizarre that at the moment it is sticking to a line that you've got to defend the territorial integrity of the Ukraine, even though it is so clearly a failed state. We have always been on the side of the small peoples. We've been on the side of democracy. Our argument, ever since the Bruges speech, has been on the side of democracy. It's against the big battalions. We favoured the breakup of the Soviet Union. And this is why we don't like the European Union, because the European Union is on the side of the big battalions. It's in favour of centralised state power. It's against the liberation of peoples from oppression. And this is one of the reasons why I, and I'm sure many other people, have been so alarmed by the development of the EU recently, and their whole approach, which is simply to keep states together, irrespective of the fact they may have failed, and irrespective of the fact that there's a better alternative. This is profoundly depressing.
In this film we have looked at the blundering that is the EU's single foreign policy in Ukraine. With this, the first highly visible EU foreign policy adventure, we see the emergence of the Euro neocons eager for conflict. Why? To create Euro nationalism. First of all, this crisis has been very bad for Ukraine. Even if the EU didn't instigate the Euromaidan putsch, their encouragement at every step of the way has been a major contributing factor. Ukraine may not have maintained a stable democracy since the end of the Cold War, but they were getting there. Now the country is looking like a failed state, with little prospect for stability for the foreseeable future. Certainly, losing territory to Russia by popular vote was not part of the plan. The EU encouraged the putsch, but does not have the capacity to support a damaged Ukraine. This crisis has been bad for Russia. The Euromaidan putsch took Russia by surprise. Although coverage of the Sochi Games was somewhat hostile, no one in the Kremlin reckoned on this. But Russia now has to deal with an hysterical cast of EU politicians bent on wreaking economic havoc. This hostility impedes Russia's progress since Soviet times. This is most dangerous for those countries that joined the EU exactly for their fear of Russia. Those Baltic countries that were formerly occupied by the USSR. Their existence depends on a normal relationship with a Russia at peace with herself and her neighbours. But Brussels has chosen the cheap thrill of antagonism and to impose upon Ukraine an association agreement that creates a neo-colonial relationship between that country and the EU. Most of all, for Britain. We have no national interest in supporting the EU's Drang nach Osten, no interest in conflict with Russia. Why even should we support Brussels against Moscow? But this is not the point. It is not about being pro-Russian. Every opponent of the EU must oppose the Euro neocons and their dangerous expansionism.